welcome back to Parenting in the Trenches. In this series on adoption, we thought it was really important to talk about FASD and what that means for parenting. And last year, we did a long and really well-received series on neurodevelopment and neurodiverse families. And when we have neurodivergent children, how parenting needs to be shaped differently, how our own self-care needs to be shaped differently, and how our worlds just feel really different. And so naming some of the reality of that and also giving us some hope today about how to do that well and what the possibilities are. My guest today is Natalie Vecchione. She is a FASD parent advocate. She's a podcaster and she's an author. But most importantly, she's a wife and a homeschool mom of 2. Natalie and her husband, John, built their family through domestic adoption. Their son, who is 19 now, lives with FASD. He has graduated from homeschool, works part-time, and lives interdependently. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. With his 2 best friends. Their daughter is 6.5, and they have a much different adoption journey with her. They're really close with their daughter's birth mom. Natalie turned her family's unique challenges and journey with FASD from a career reinvention into a calling. I love that. When she and her husband began FASD Hope in October 2020. So if you're curious about that, I'm going to tell you a bit more. Natalie has been an FASD podcaster for almost 2 years now. And in October 2020, Natalie and John co-founded FASD Hope, which is a podcast, a website, and a place for awareness, information, and inspiration for those whose lives have been touched by FASD. The FASD Hope podcast series is through the lens of parent advocates with over 19 years of lived experience, and it's available pretty much wherever you find your podcasts, so check that out. Natalie's recent book, called Blazing New Homeschool Trails, Educating and Launching Teens with Developmental Disabilities by Natalie Vecchione and Cindy LaJoy, is now available on Amazon. I'll put all of that in the show notes. But for now, let's have a live conversation with Natalie. Welcome. Natalie, I'm so glad you joined us today. We've got a few things to talk about, and we have some overlapping experiences here, not so much on the FASD front, but on the adoption side of things and openness in adoption. And I know your journey has been a little different between your kids. So maybe we'll start there. Welcome here. And would you kick us off with a bit of a summary about how your family developed to what it is today?
Absolutely. Very non-traditionally is how I would say our family developed. Before I start, I want to say I love the name of your podcast. I think it's so perfect because it's just, it captures the feelings that we have when we're parenting, when we have hard parenting journeys. It captures that, yeah, you're in the trenches, and knowing that somebody else is in the trenches with you is very reassuring. So I just wanted to say I really love your title and what your podcast does. My husband and I had a total abdominal hysterectomy when I was 28 due to very severe endometriosis. So we created our family through adoption, domestic adoption. Our son, we adopted him when he was 2.5 weeks old. He was considered a medical needs adoption because after he was born, he had some medical issues, which we later found out many years later was related to his prenatal alcohol exposure. So we have in the beginning, so our son will be 20 this year. In the beginning, his birth mom wrote us letters, but she stopped that when he was about 2. So really, we have very little information about our son's background. We know nothing about his birth father. So he is 20 now, and I'll share a little bit about our journey in a second. And our daughter, we have a totally different experience. She has a totally different adoption journey. Our daughter's birth mother was actually one of my former flute students when we were living in Philadelphia. as well as she and her sister used to babysit, excuse me, my son when he was younger. So we had moved away from Philadelphia and we were living in New York. And it was around 2014. Our son was 12 at the time, almost 13. And our our daughter's birth mom reached out to me through Facebook and messaged me and said, my mom said, you all were interested in looking at adopting again, and I'm pregnant, and would you consider adopting my baby? And just like when we got the phone call for our son, I just kind of dropped to my knees both times and just just said, thank you, God. And so her journey is much different.
Oh man.
Yeah. Her journey is much different. So we know we consider her my daughter's adoption. It's extremely open. My husband is in contact with her birth father, and pretty much I would say several times a week we text and send pictures to my daughter's birth mother and her birth aunt and her other aunt, and so we have this very open relationship with her and her family. So and that's something I've had to it's a balancing act. Any of you listening out there, if you have a child with a closed adoption journey and a child with an open adoption journey, it's a balancing act, because there were many times, it really wasn't until about a year or two ago that our son was able to really, he's still healing, but embrace how close we were to our daughter's birth family. So you have to have that respect, so it's definitely a balancing act. But yeah, so and my husband and I were not planning on having our children 13 years apart, but that's how it happened.
And the age gap, that's a whole dynamic in and of itself.
Our son will be 20 and our daughter will be 7. So yeah, we have a 13-year age gap, which is pretty amazing. But I embrace it and I love it, because we learned so much from parenting our son. And now our daughter's journey is much different, and yet we're able to use everything we've learned about, just parenting our son, who has a neurodiversity, who has a developmental disability, use that when, with our daughter, and just really looking at her and her brain and who she is and what's behind things. I learned with our son, I learned, it took me a long time, but I really learned that when you parent a child, whether, adopted, whether who's experienced trauma, and that trauma be prenatal or lived experience, or just, I like to say, when you parent a child who's in a hard place, you really have to, as a parent, step back and say, okay, what's going on in their brain? What's going on in their body? Instead of, oh, this is just a willful behavior. So really that's a big part of who we are, why we founded our podcast, why we founded our book, is because my husband and I just learned this. Okay, it was really a paradigm shift for us, and we needed to share it with other parents so they could understand that when you do make that shift from, oh, they don't want to do something, to, oh, their brain is not letting them do it, then you parent differently. And that parenting differently is extremely helpful in helping that child grow developmentally.
It's an incredible mind shift when we go from my child won't to my child can't. We hear those stories over and over in the counseling office, in podcast interviews. Anybody who has been through the hard zone with kids and has been changed by it and has learned from it, I find there's this common, I can't keep this stuff to myself, because it changes so profoundly how we are in relationship with our children, that it feels like we can't let other parents not know about this. Right? It just changes so much.
to also say too, our son, gave us his consent to share our journey to, for me to co-author this book, to write, to start this podcast and to help other parents, because, his words verbatim were, Mom, I don't want another kid to have to go through what I went through. It was 15 years before we finally received the correct, appropriate diagnosis. And those were 15 very hard years. So if our sharing our journey can help a family receive the right diagnosis and to make that paradigm shift much sooner than we did, then we definitely understand why we're on that journey. And that's why he has shared, I don't want other kids to have to go through what I went through.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit about what FASD is? So when we talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I think the very nature of most disorders is that it's not cookie cutter. There are lots of gray areas about trying to understand, and that's why professionals and lived experience come so important and key to really understanding our kids, because it is not super straightforward most of the time for most diagnoses. And I want to kind of tap your breadth of experience from the number of years you have walked this and researched and advocated and come into contact with so many people. Where are you at? Can you help us unravel the picture of FASD? Not the diagnostic list, but the picture. What does it look like, feel like, parent like, experience like? What's happening?
I can try. Yeah. So I guess to give you that 5-minute elevator talk, as we all like to joke around. So FASD is a term for the disabilities that have been caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. FASD stands for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And under the umbrella of FASD are 5 different diagnoses, again, caused from prenatal alcohol exposure. Fetal alcohol syndrome, which is what most people think of when they think of FASD. They think of the quote unquote face, the facial characteristics, the small head, things like that, which only happen in 1 out of 10 FASD diagnoses. So it's not as full-blown FAS is not as common. We don't see those outward characteristics in 90% of the kids, teens, adults who are diagnosed with FASD. So FAS is the first diagnosis under that umbrella, under this spectrum umbrella. Partial fetal alcohol syndrome is the second. The third is alcohol-related birth defects. The fourth is neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, or NDPAE. And the fifth one is alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND. So those five diagnoses are under the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder umbrella. And basically, they are disabilities. FASD is a brain-based, whole-body disability caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. And as a spectrum disorder, we know with other spectrum disorders, such as autism, it looks different with every child, every teen, every adult. Because with FASD, when the alcohol affects the unborn child, plus a number of other factors, including, maternal health, maternal diet, trauma, there's a whole constellation of factors that can affect an FASD, not just the alcohol. So we share in the FASD community that it's really important to recognize that not only is the brain affected by the alcohol exposure, but the body is. There are over 400 comorbid medical diagnoses that can come with an FASD. And again, looking back, as when we first brought home our son was born with medical needs, which we later found out were related to his prenatal alcohol exposure. So there are some key things to remember with FASD that I would like to communicate and what I've learned as a parent. Number one, it's a lifelong disability. You don't outgrow FASD. And I shared in my book, and I think I may have shared with you, Karen, that when we were first told that our son they suspected prenatal alcohol exposure, the neurologist at the sleep study, it was a hospital that we didn't normally take our son to. It was a different teaching hospital. The neurologist came in for the follow-up visit. My son was on my lap facing the doctor and the group of medical students, and my husband was sitting next to me. And the doctor very flippantly said, "Oh, look at that child. He has mild fetal alcohol effects," which, again, there is no such thing as mild fetal alcohol effects. Fetal alcohol is the most harmful of all the teratogens. Alcohol is the most harmful, and it's lifelong. So he said that, and my husband and I were just, we didn't know what to do. And we said, well, this is the first time somebody's mentioned this. And the neurologist said, oh, well, just put him in early intervention and he'll be fine. And we know that,
Natalie.
yeah. And Karen, the other thing is he never wrote down the diagnosis. So it was he told us verbally. It wasn't until 13 years after that did we actually receive a written diagnosis of our son having an FASD. And all the time in between, we would ask whenever our son would see a new specialist or educational professional, anything, we would always say, hey, we were told this when he was 2. Could this be it? And everybody said no. Until I went to a parent group and met with a parent navigator who said, yes, I believe you. And
yay,
that
parents!
Exactly.
Oh my goodness,
it's so validating to hear, especially, from other parents who have children that have your child's diagnosis.
They know it. From the inside out, they know
it. Exactly.
Yeah.
So a couple of fast facts about FASD. Number one, it is the leading cause of disabilities, of preventable disabilities. Alcohol, I want to say this properly so that your listeners can hear it.
Okay. Yeah.
Prenatal alcohol exposure is the leading preventable birth defect in the United States. And a lot of FASD, a lot of the awareness and advocacy we do involves, no amount of alcohol is safe during pregnancy. And if you are thinking about, conceiving, stop any consumption of alcohol. No amount of alcohol is safe. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the prevalence of FASD is so much higher than we think. A recent 2018 study done here in North Carolina by Dr. Philip May at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, estimated that 1 in 20 children have an FASD. And this was a JAMA published study. This is really one of the hallmark studies that we look to say the prevalence is much higher than we know. So we know that number is higher than autism. It's higher than many other developmental disabilities put together. So the prevalence is much higher. And then finally, the impact of alcohol, prenatal alcohol exposure, is so much more damaging than we think because you can't see inside the brain. My son actually, prior to diagnosis, he had a couple of MRIs, none of which indicated his having an FASD.
Interesting.
Now, some of them do if it's very, very severe, but in many times, 9 times, I don't know the statistic for MRIs and FASD, but I can tell you that because the impact is in the brain. We know that alcohol crosses the limbic system, so you know, things like memory, executive functioning, processing, language processing, visual, hearing processing. There are so many primary characteristics of having an FASD. And so I guess the final thing I want to leave before I start talking about our parenting journey, which actually all of this ties into our parenting journey, is FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is the most undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and underdiagnosed of all developmental disabilities. And it's really a lifelong disability. So when you're parenting a child that has an FASD, it's not just, okay, you're an adult now, you're done. And I'll talk about this a little further in our interview. You really have to learn the dance of interdependence. Because of how alcohol impacts the brain, there is one of the biggest hallmark traits of FASD is something known as dysmaturity, which is we hear that a lot in neurodiversity communities. So we know dysmaturity is the gap between chronological age, which would be above, and then developmental age, which would be lower. Yeah. Now, with FASD, with other developmental disabilities, as they get older, many are able to, the trajectory doesn't widen so dramatically in the teen years as FASD does. So in other words, what we saw in our son, he was able to go to, I call regular school because we've been homeschooling for the past 8 years, but he was able to go to regular school. He just received, pull out reading, pull out maths, that kind of thing. As he grew older and as more was expected from him, which would be executive and adaptive functioning, then that dysmaturity gap widened. And that is a big hallmark trait in FASD. And we see that. And then say you have adopted a child who experienced trauma, lived trauma, or, any other type of, and also acknowledge there is trauma in adoption, period. Your child is not
always
with their biological parents. So there's that inherent trauma. There are layers of trauma on top of the prenatal trauma. And then when you get to puberty, not only do the expectations of our society, community, schools, etc., grow, we expect, teens now, they should be able to remember their, class schedule or remember their locker combination, that kind of thing. We're putting more demands on them, and their brain is still progressing at a trajectory that's not as in line with, their chronologically aged peers. So the gap widens and the gap widens. And that's where we see the secondary characteristics, things like depression, self-harm, anxiety, so many other things, because we are trying to make them work harder rather than say,
to keep up.
Okay, exactly. Rather than shift that paradigm of thinking to they can't do something. It's not that they won't.
Yeah. When you were talking about the prevalence rates and how often this is underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, particularly in the area of adoption, because I remember being told by our adoption agency social worker that when you're reading the proposal for the adoptee, potentially, the medical outline is going to say this, this, and this. This is the information you're going to get provided. Because it's self-report from birth parents, you are likely to find that they severely underreport alcohol and drug use during pregnancy. And so your job is to kind of expect to triple whatever they're reporting. That's what we were told. And I remember nothing else on that form we had to do any kind of formula interpretation for or adjusting. It was just, well, this is the best we could find out about this birth parents' medical history of, they were willing to tell us if there was diabetes in the background. They were willing to tell us if there was some anxiety disorder in their history. But when it came to how much alcohol was ingested during pregnancy, the shame attached to that in our culture meant that they were underreporting. I understand that, right? And so right from the get-go, before we even had a child in arms, we were already experiencing and coming across this stigma.
Mm-hmm. And
that
so
can you talk about that? The stigma of parenting, the stigma of FASD?
Absolutely. So I actually had the privilege, the honor of interviewing Dr. Kenneth Lyons Jones, who was one of the two doctors who discovered fetal alcohol syndrome almost 50 years ago in 1973.
Amazing.
And he told me that stigma is the biggest problem of why FASD is not further along and recognized and treated and everything
Makes
that
sense.
it should be. Because there is such stigma in, we shame birth parents, we shame, biological parents. There are so many parents who have children who have their children, and their children acquire all these diagnoses, and they didn't realize that, oops, I drank before I realized I was pregnant, So there is such a stigma associated with FASD. So I guess to explain to your listeners, imagine just your child having a medical diagnosis that impacts their brain. Now imagine trying to find somebody who's going to give you the appropriate diagnosis, because either they're worried that, having that label is going to just be horrible for that child, or we just
just don't name it. We'll just not have to deal with it. Yeah,
exactly. And then the stigma of society, when you say fetal alcohol or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or prenatal alcohol exposure, most of society has a certain picture in their mind, and it's a very dark, bleak, not good prognosis for that child, that teen, that adult. And so parenting a child with an FASD is such a hard journey, because not only do you have the complexity of parenting a child that has this brain-based whole body disability, but then you have all of society just about, unless you can find that gem of a person who believes you or who supports you. Again, this is why we need this legislation that I'll tell you about in a minute that has been introduced, this national legislation. But you're parenting a child that has a developmental disability, a neurodiversity, and then you have our society that's like, oh, that's bad. Oh, that's bad. We don't even talk about that. That's bad. And I can remember, Karen, when we were redoing our home study for our daughter, who has not been prenatally exposed to alcohol. She does not have an FASD. She has neurodiversity, but she does not have an FASD. I remember being in the class, and the social worker, I remember we had this activity where we had to talk about true or false statements, when kind of like what you're talking about on the paper, on the form. Oh, is this true, or is this false?
Testing your assumptions.
Exactly. And one of the statements, and I had it, of course, it came to me. I had it. One of the statements was, prenatal alcohol exposure is not permanent. And I said, this is absolutely false. And this was before our son had his diagnosis, because at that point I was already researching FASD. I was already learning, even though he didn't get a diagnosis until a few years later. And I told it to the social worker. She's like, no, it's true. It's not permanent. And I said, you're a social worker who works with kids in foster care, and and talking slowly, states are starting to recognize, especially in foster care, where more than 80% of children in foster care have an FASD. States are starting to recognize and provide education, but it's very little. I mean, Minnesota is wonderful. They have, it's mandatory. They had it passed into law a couple of years ago that not only if you're a child, if a child is in foster care, they need to be screened for prenatal alcohol exposure for an FASD. That's fantastic. But then also, anyone who works with the child needs to take training to learn about FASD. That should be in every state. That should actually be in every country.
My goodness, yeah.
Honestly. So so there's that stigma of, oh no, we just don't talk about it, even though it's the most prevalent of developmental disabilities. And
it scares us the most.
It does.
Right.
It does scare us the most because we hear those grim statistics of okay, the life expectancy. That one, that's just the elephant in the room. Let's talk about the life expectancy and the studies that say, okay, 30s and mid 30s is life expectancy for someone with prenatal alcohol exposure. But what they don't say in those studies is if this person has not been supported, not been properly diagnosed, not had proper accommodations and services. That's what they fail to say. So everybody just sees that and says, oh my goodness, 34. Oh, we can't talk about that.
Can't enter that.
Instead of, okay, get a diagnosis, get the supports, find the people who will support your child, create pathways where there are none. And again, like you're talking about, just shift that paradigm to, it's not that my child won't do something, it's their brain can't. And when you do that, you are giving your children so much more opportunity than those grim statistics.
That's right. Absolutely. So it's permanent, but it isn't a static path.
Yes,
with
there
supports,
growth. And
it
actually
expands and it grows and change. Right.
And actually, in the FASD training that I've taken as a parent, and that I've spoken with quite a few clinicians and professionals about this, in FASD and other brain-based diagnoses too, brain development, usually in a typically developing young adult, usually in the early 20s, it kind of peaks off, and that's about it. In FASD, we see development jumps in the mid-20s and even in the late 20s. And that excites me because our son is about to turn 20.
Exciting.
Knowing that he's got those jumps coming up gives me like hope. And even so, we're at a place, he lives interdependently. He lives, away from us, but we're supporting him, but yet he's supporting himself. And we have this really great, we're just so blessed. We have this wonderful opportunity, this living situation for him that we've created with another family that really shows that, okay, they can grow. It's like you said, it's not static. It doesn't have to be static. But again, you also, you can't just say, oh, it's up to the kid. No, it's up to the parent.
It doesn't go away.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Okay. I'm most excited about our last topic of conversation, but before we get to that, I don't want to skip over the hard advocacy work you're doing around the legislation piece. Now, I'm in Canada. We have listeners all over the place, but you're based in the States and you recognize the discrepancy from state to state. And I think the value of us covering this piece is to help envision what's possible in comparison to where we're experiencing it in our own provinces, states, countries, regions, right?
Yes.
So when policy and legislation is made around mental health care, service provision, support-based services, diagnostic pieces, right? That medical care, where are you currently finding the gaps and what are you working toward? What are you noticing are kind of the top eeks points, like the ones like, oh, dang, that's not good. We need something there. And what's being done about that in the legislation that you're talking about?
So really, I think that the biggest gaps are in once you, first of all, the number of people available who can give an appropriate diagnosis, finding a doctor, a clinic to diagnose FASD here in the States is hard. Mm-hmm. Canada, actually, you all are ahead of the US in terms of, diagnosing, in terms of just quite a few other things. You all are ahead of us, and we look to Canada. And actually, FASD is a wonderful resource for in Canada, as well as some others I can share with you. As a parent, I've found the biggest gaps are, and we had this discussion prior to recording, where your child receives that diagnosis, but then they don't qualify for services because they are not at that percentage that qualifies. So maybe, they have a delay, but it's not 40%, it's 30%. So they can't receive it. And so that's one. Another huge gap is just getting qualifying for services because of FASD here in the United States. It's not recognized as a diagnosable developmental disability, which this act that I'm going to talk about in a minute, the FASD Respect Act, that's one of the key tenets of it, is that nationally we'll recognize FASD as a diagnosable developmental disability. So that's another one. And I know in Canada there's that difficulty too. As our children get older and have an FASD, and as that dysmaturity widens, as those executive functioning lags, worsen or just stay the same. Yeah. I've found personally that as our children get older, you go from minimal services to no services and supports. So family supports, clinical pathways, things like just finding, testing in the schools, educating teachers so they know that what they're seeing is brain-based symptoms. In the same way that, other disabilities such as autism, they have that, okay, here's a diagnosis, here's a pathway, here's a plan. We don't have that. So I would say all of that, honestly. And especially now having a son who's a young adult, there's nothing when it's basically like, okay, you're 18, there you go, unless you have a really significant impact, which you do, you just can't see it. You're basically on your own. So here in the States, the FASD Respect Act has been introduced to the legislation, to Congress. Mm-hmm. And what it says basically is that FASD is a diagnosable developmental disability. It provides funding for prevention, for research, for interventions, for supporting families, to have in each state a center of FASD excellence. So similar to autism, where in each state or each province has like an autism-based, nonprofit or kind of society affiliation, having that for FASD. And then especially supports as our children get older. So educating the educators, educating community, it just so many there. Basically, FASD affects everyone, and getting this legislation passed is just so critical for the FASD community, because it also just provides hope in that, okay, yes, this is a diagnosable disability.
It's recognized and it's supported. Yeah.
Exactly. I would say that. And then, of course, let's go back to the stigma, by saying, yes, this is more prevalent than we realize, this is more impactful than we realize, then we can also address and educate that stigma and say, okay, you know what? It wasn't so-and-so's fault. We need to educate and talk about prevention more. And then we need to support more, and we need to support parents and birth parents. It's just this ripple effect that I have a lot of hope. It's called the FASD Respect Act in the United States, HR 4151 S2238. You can learn more about it from fasdunited.org. You can also
Great.
visit FASDhope.com and we can share that information. And I will also give you, Karen, the direct information.
Yeah.
And I know
Amazing.
in Canada, Canada is making strides too. Australia is making huge strides in their FASD advocacy. The UK, I'm really hopeful, especially in the past few years, and especially, you know, the silver lining of COVID is that technology has made advocacy so much more accessible to people and support so much more accessible to people. So having that accessibility increases your opportunity to learn, and it increases your opportunity to do something.
Amazing. Okay, your advocacy hat, we're going to add your back in your parenting hat. Now tell us, because I'm buzzing about this. Okay, so we talk about the spectrum of the disorder. I want to talk about the spectrum of dependence to independence. So you beautifully coined that term, interdependence, which I love it so much. That you and I align so well on that front. I think everything is about the interdependence. We are not striving ever for full independence. We actually need each other, and that's good. It's healthy. It's lovely. What that looks like for kids who are neurodivergent has a different color hue to it, right? The painting gets painted slightly differently, and it should be, because it should match the needs of the child. It should not match the needs of our hopes or expectations only, right? Our assumptions and our just catch up. We don't want that. So the painting should look different. What does the spectrum look like from your perspective? You've lived some of these legs of the journey, right? Where you had to question, okay, where are we at now? What does interdependence look like now? We know that doesn't just happen when they leave your physical home. That happens all the way throughout of where are we now in the development stage, and what can we support for an interdependent situation. So what does it look like? What can it look like? Help us dream.
So for us, and my co-author and friend Cindy LaJoy and I, we share in our book, Blazing New Homeschool Trails, Educating and Launching Teens with Developmental Disabilities, we have a chapter devoted to interdependence. Interdependence is essentially you are utilizing your teen, young adults' strengths and incorporating them so that they can live to their fullest potential. And at the same time, I liken it to like a tether cord. You as the parent caregiver, and we've had to do it all on our own with the help of, we call them our family, our friends who have become family, who, you know, who are the parents of our son's roommates. You have to develop these supports and have things in place and recognize, okay, my young adult, my teen, my young adult will need help with, for example, meals, food planning, that kind of thing. So what you do in interdependence, and it's a journey, it happens, you know, you really can't just say, okay, at 20, we're going to do this. And at 25, no, it's really, you are constantly assessing the needs and the strengths of your young adult. So how it looked for us, our son, basically, I co-authored this book, and I talked about how, you know, our son became a carpentry apprentice. And then literally in the fall, he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to move away from home. And initially we bought our property, we bought our house because we have a workshop that we were going to convert to a tiny house for him. He's like, I don't want to do that. And that took some grieving, because I was like, okay, that's what we were planning for the past 4 years, but okay,
new plans.
And what did he want? He wanted to have his own place away from mom and dad. Okay, how are we going to do that? It took a lot of faith, a lot of, you know, just discernment. And finally, our friends who have 2 young adults, one of whom also is a neurodivergent, who understand our son's needs and strengths, we we as two families, we said, you know what, these three guys can live together and it can work, and here's how we
Wow.
support them. So for us, we taught them about, okay, this is when the rent is due and this is where it goes. And we made, the apartment where our son lives, it's an hour from us, so it's close enough so that he can keep all of his doctors, specialists, therapists, counselors, and everything.
Yes, that's
But
a
it's
big
far
one.
enough away
Yeah.
from mom and dad where, hey, mom and dad are not here. It, you think about things like, okay, what kind of environment does your child want to live in? Our son doesn't have his license, so he lives in an area that he can walk to everything, and that's good. Or he can ride his scooter to everything. So really, interdependence is, it's a lot. And I hate to say this, it's a lot of work for you parents, and also it's honesty with your child to say, okay, let's try this. And so I'll give an example. One of the things we did was, our roommate's family, and we take turns making meals for our kids and putting them in the freezer and just, helping them out and whatnot. So funny story about interdependence. So my husband and I were like, okay, it's going to be their first Christmas away from home, and they moved in December. So I had like this turkey dinner and everything. Everything was all prepped. All they had to do was heat it. Well, they were just having such a good time and just talking that they had ramen for Christmas dinner. And however, they all loved it. And I was like, okay, good to know. They just wanted ramen, and I laugh, and I'm not like saying this in a mocking way. I'm saying this in okay, I learned what I thought they would want was totally different. And so I learned that, hey, you know what? They like to do, they like to stop by the drive-through here, stop by the drive-through there. Okay, giving them, some gift cards, or okay, one of the things that we do is on their fridge, we have, okay, this is the envelope for when the rent is due. This is where it goes. This is it's really teaching them and being active in that process. And they have independence, but we are a part of it. And it's a great thing because honestly, it teaches us about how traditional we grew up. I mean, my husband and I, we grew up like, okay, you're 19, bye, there you go. And when you parent a child whose brain works differently, again, it's that we have to think of what are they capable of doing, not whether they will or will they won't. Again, my preparation of that wonderful turkey dinner and leaving it for them, I thought that, okay, they just wanted to talk and have ramen. And again, that's what they wanted. And
beautiful.
That's just, and there was I was just like, okay, we'll just, noted,
Noted.
And it really is a lot of preparation, a lot of communication, open communication. But my son is working. He has an employer who understands his diagnosis and disability and is training him at his pace, which is amazing. Again, I never, 5 years ago, Karen, I never thought that would be possible. So I have to say, with interdependence, you have a lot of hope. You really do. And I'm even thinking like, wow, if, we're only 2 months into what I call the interdependence experiment, of him living, with his two friends. I'm like thinking, wow, I can only imagine what's going to happen in a few years, because I'm just happy that, it's succeeding so far. So yeah, it really
and
is.
Isn't that the thing? You can't predict. That's part of it, right? So you can see what's in front of you if you're willing to look hard and be a good detective and be super curious and stay loving and supportive around this. But it only takes you so far because you can't know where things will be in a few months from now even.
Yes.
And so this constant, all I hear like in these journeys and stories of parenting is the constant elongated pivoting. You're always reshaping and resetting and going, okay, new learning. Oh, that's a thing. Oh, I didn't realize. Oh, that worked. We can build on that. And it's experimental, not because you said, we're going to set up a home, you go there, and we're just going to see how it goes. Every moment is experimental. Every decision, every meal, every test, you're watching to see what does it produce or doesn't produce. And then what do we build in our bank and our toolkits and help support differently? So
Yes.
person-centered and collaborative, right?
And let go of expectations. The Christmas dinner was an example of
You
an
have to,
expectation I
right?
had.
Uh-huh.
I thought, oh, okay, because
Yeah.
when they were at home, they always, no, I let go. Don't be
Yeah.
married to expectations, because
Yeah.
they will just. And I love, Karen, how you say pivot. Yes, it is all about pivoting, and it's we have to think of it. A wonderful guest, who's a doctor, told me that we need to think of FASD and other brain-based disabilities as a spiral staircase. So you're going up, but you really don't know what's. And I love that. I love
That's
that
awesome.
illustration. Yeah, I love that illustration. And he is on the front lines. He is diagnosing and on the front lines. And he used that illustration. And I thought, that is so brilliant and so beautiful. It's a spiral staircase. We don't know what's coming up ahead, and there's a lot of turns, and we can't see at the top of the staircase. So we just have to have hope in that next step and in that next step. And I really think that's our whole journey. That's FASD. That's, brain-based neurodiversity. That's interdependence. That's this whole journey of parenting a child whose brain is wired differently.
Wow. Okay. When you opened today and you said, I love the name of the podcast, and you named why, and really that's just because you get the lived experience of the mud in a trench and how the companionship means so much in a community with each other when we're all in the mud. And I want to finish by saying I love the name of your organization, because FASD Hope is the thing that drew me toward you to find, who is this human and how do we talk to her? We need to talk to her because of the hope piece, because I think what tends to happen is parents fall in the category of resignation. I resign, it's stuck. This is just frustrating and hard. That's all it can be. Or it's so hard to look at. I refuse, and not in a choice way, but almost like it's so scary to me because of what I've heard and the stigma attached, that I don't know how to bend and adjust my sails to feel good moving forward. And so then we miss out on resources, we miss out on support, we miss out on community because we're isolated in this journey. So I wanted so badly to give anyone who will listen the opportunity to hear a story that says both the mud in the trench and the hope that is possible. So when I asked you strategically help us dream, I meant that, because I think we stop short on a lot of our kids with brain injury to say, because it's permanent, there's nothing we can do. And I wanted that to blow the ceiling off that and say, we don't actually know what's possible in a month, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. And so to find each other and to share those stories of hope give us that tether point to something possible in the future. I really, really appreciated how you articulated that today. Thank you for spending time with me talking about that.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. This has been a wonderful conversation. And when you are in the trenches and your boots have mud on them, you still can have so much hope.
Yeah. The sun can shine. So good. Thank you, Natalie. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Karen, so much.